Is there one diet that's absolutely proven to help you live a longer and healthier life? Well, it turns out there is. Let's take a look at exactly what we know to be true. And how did eating get to be so complicated? You'd think by now human beings would have come up with the perfect human diet, the most advantageous, the one that's going to help you live the longest and healthiest life. But the fact is, you can go on Amazon.com and you can find over 50,000 titles about diet. And they can't all be right. Well, believe it or not, amidst all that clutter, there is at least one thing that there's widespread agreement and lots of scientific data to support it. One thing that we can do when it comes to our diets that will help us live a longer, healthier life. So let's take a look at some of the things that we have evidence for and a good reason to believe are true. Like every other animal on the planet, human beings survived at least partly because we're able to adapt to our environment. We know that at least in our early history, the food environment couldn't have been anything like today's food environment. Agriculture didn't even exist back then. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle defined the first principles as the first basis from which a thing is known. It's kind of a physics way of drilling down to find out what we know for sure is true. Elon Musk did a good job of describing it.
Because it's kind of mentally easier to reason by analogy rather than from first principles. But by first principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world. And what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths and say, okay, what are we sure is true or as sure as possible is true? And then reason up from there.
So what do we know for sure about longevity? Well, there's a lot of things that we think contribute to longevity, like exercise, maybe some red wine and some certain dietary supplements. But there's one method accepted by science that you can use to consistently increase longevity. Let's listen to renowned theoretical physicist Michio Kaku, I hope I got his name right, talk about what we know for sure on that subject.
If I take any organism on the planet Earth, from yeast cells to spiders, insects, rabbits, dogs, and even monkeys now, and I reduce their caloric intake by 30%, they live 30% longer. In fact, the only organism which has not yet been deliberately tested by scientists are Homo sapiens. All the other species obey this basic rule. You starve them to death, they live longer.
Experiments conducted since the early 1900s have shown that depending on the animal, a 30% reduction in overall caloric intake can result in a 30% increased lifespan. So let's apply the first principles from there. Most of us in the Western world grew up believing that you need to get 3 balanced meals a day to stay healthy. Eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner was absolutely normal for most of us. Breakfast was always the most important meal of the day, and you needed a healthy lunch to focus on the rest of the school day, and you couldn't imagine going to bed without dinner. So if we wanted to decrease caloric intake and follow the conventional wisdom, we'd have to decrease the amount of food we eat at each of these meals. But where did the 3 meals a day idea come from? Abigail Carroll suggests in her book, 3 Squares, The Invention of the American Meal, that eating 3 meals a day was basically invented due to culture, not out of biological necessity. It goes back to the Middle Ages when they would eat a light meal before going out to work, then a heavy meal in the middle of the day, and then another light meal at night. When European settlers got to America, they found Native Americans were basically just eating whenever they felt the urge to, rather than on a specified time schedule. The Europeans took their lack of defined eating times as evidence that they were just uncivilized, and they had them change. In short, the 3 meals a day paradigm is not based on our biological needs. When we were hunter-gatherers, it wouldn't have been unusual at all to feast on a big kill and then survive on very little or no food for an extended period of time, until we could either find something in our environment to eat or kill something else. And until recent history, the environment we lived in would suggest that if we weren't able to do that, we probably wouldn't be alive as a species today. Until we discovered agriculture, eating 3 meals a day, and in some cases even eating every day, was probably nearly impossible. You can argue the fact that life expectancy in prehistoric times was much lower than now, and you might say that's a sign that our modern eating habits are healthier. But infant mortality rate was a big factor in bringing that number down, and you have to understand that one of the effects of modern civilization and technology is that you can be unresourceful and made of weak genetic material and not die. As Doug McGuff explains,
it didn't really have anything to do with anabolic-catabolic balance or long-term health benefits, because there were older survivors, and the fossil evidence of those older survivors, based on ligamentous attachments and bony assessment and bone mineral density, they were extraordinarily robust.
There's a common misconception that a stable blood glucose level is necessary for survival, which would biologically justify 3 meals a day. But biochemistry shows us why constantly consuming carbohydrates to maintain blood glucose is not only unnecessary, but it can be detrimental and a vicious cycle. So here's the biochemistry. After you eat some carbs like bread or potatoes or rice, glucose is going to enter your bloodstream, and insulin is secreted to help maintain proper blood glucose levels. An insulin receptor causes glucose to enter the cells, and a chain of enzymes act on it to produce energy in the form of ATP. This process produces a waste product called pyruvate. Then our mitochondria process the pyruvate through the Krebs cycle, which produces much more ATP. A waste product called citrate or citrate is produced in the mitochondria, and when enough stacks up, it blocks an enzyme called phosphofructokinase in the enzyme chain, which prevents excess glucose from doing any harm to the cell. When the process can't continue downward, around 70 grams of glucose is stored in the liver, and around 200 grams is stored in the muscle, depending on the size of you. So if you've eaten a morning bowl of cereal and have some toast and jelly, you've probably stored all the glucose you can store. And after that, glucose can no longer be converted to ATP in the cell or stored in the liver or in the muscle. And your body can't handle glucose overloading the cells or building up in the bloodstream, so because it creates a harmful situation called glycation, where glucose binds to the proteins and inhibits their functions. So your body continues to secrete insulin to deal with the glucose. The insulin receptors on your cells become resistant to the insulin everywhere, except on your body fat. Your fat cells don't have the same complex machinery that other cells have, so this is the safest place to store it. Your body fat is not just an energy storage reserve, it's also protecting you from glycation damage. The problem with all that is that if your energy levels start to drop, you can't tap the energy out of your stored body fat, because the hormone that does that, hormone-sensitive lipase, is sensitive to insulin. Insulin won't allow you to use body fat for energy. If you have an elevated insulin level in your bloodstream and you need energy, you're going to get hungry, and you're going to have to boost your blood sugar by eating a snack or a meal. That's why if you're following the recommended American diet, you're usually going to be stuck in this loop of wanting to eat every time your blood glucose drops, and 3 meals a day will feel very necessary. Here's medical doctor Peter Attia talking about how it affected him.
Despite exercising 3 or 4 hours every single day and following the food pyramid to the letter, I gained a lot of weight and developed something called metabolic syndrome.
Fortunately, our bodies have another source of energy that's a lot more efficient and stable than glucose. Ketone bodies are produced by the liver from fatty acids to produce energy when you've depleted your glycogen stores, which takes 10 to 12 hours depending on your activity level and body composition. And ketones can be used by our bodies to produce energy in the form of ATP. When we produce ketone bodies, we say that we're in ketosis, which is sometimes referred to as a starvation mode, but that doesn't mean you're about to starve. You might think that carbohydrates are our body's primary fuel source, but in fact it's possible to live entirely without carbohydrates. And in fact, there's good examples of people like Inuit tribes and the famous people like Jordan Peterson who thrive on basically nothing but meat. There's an Egyptian pyramid inscription from around 3800 BC that reads, "Humans live on 1/4 of what they eat, and on the other 3/4 lives their doctor." Plato apparently fasted for greater mental efficiency, and Mark Twain suggested fasting was more effective than any medicine. The Romans even found that they could cure epileptics, who they thought were possessed by demons, by shutting them in a room without food. To simplify an incredibly complex process, aging is in essence a result of cumulative damage to your DNA. Professor of genetics David Sinclair and his team found that not eating stimulates the sirtuin proteins, which are directly responsible for DNA repair. Mark Mattson, a professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University, gave a speech at TEDx Johns Hopkins University talking about the extensive benefits of fasting for your brain and body. In particular, fasting stimulates the production of neurotrophic growth factors, BDNF and FGF, which promote the growth of new neurons in the brain. That explains why fasting has been linked to the prevention of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There's also been quite a rise in the popularity of intermittent fasting. With intermittent fasting, you're not eating for approximately 16 hours of the day, which gives your body time to deplete the glycogen stores, start burning fat, and get some of the benefits of longer-term fasting. Whether you're doing extended fasting, intermittent fasting, or simply eating less, you're giving your body a chance to deplete the glycogen stores and dip into ketosis, which leads to many health benefits. The problem with intermittent fasting is that you can still cram 2 or 3 meals into your eating window, and that can lead to craving food outside of the 8-hour eating period if that's what you've set up as an 8-hour eating period. Upton Sinclair, who was born in the late 1800s and lived to the age of 90, published a book in 1911 called The Fasting Cure. The book was inspired by personal accounts of 250 people who cured some sort of ailment with extended fasting. These people cured ailments that ranged from colds to headaches and constipation to arthritis, heart disease, and even cancer. I'll put a link in the description to that book on Amazon. Dr. Alan Goldhammer spoke about how in 2012, a 42-year-old patient cured her stage 3 follicular lymphoma with a 21-day fast. And you can find personal accounts of people on YouTube who've cured some sort of ailment of theirs with an extended water fast. My own personal journey with eating 1 meal a day began with intermittent fasting. The first few days or maybe even weeks were pretty undisciplined. I began by not eating breakfast and just waiting until I was hungry to eat. But as time went on, I noticed that my energy levels were better and I had better mental clarity throughout the day. I didn't need that afternoon nap. I didn't have that feeling of being bogged down in the afternoon. And after just a short time, I found that I just wasn't hungry until 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And I lost more body fat faster than anything I've ever tried in the past. I also found that even if I didn't eat the healthiest meals, I could eat some real garbage, my body still had more than enough time to empty out whatever excess glycogen and toxins I had ingested. Looking back, it's hard to imagine that I had to pile so much food into my stomach throughout the day. There's abundant evidence that calorie restriction can help you live longer. And I can say from experience that by reducing my own eating window to as little as 1 meal per day has made my weight control and meal planning incredibly easy. If you're only going to cook 1 meal, it's pretty easy to work that out. If you're interested in living a longer, leaner, healthier life, it's definitely worth giving it a shot. Thanks for watching.